The Principles of Economics by Carl Menger.
Chapter 3. The Theory of Value. Section 2. The Original Measure of Value. In what has preceded, we have directed our attention to the nature and ultimate causes of value, that is, to the factors common to value in all cases. But in actual life, we find that the values of different goods are very different in magnitude, and that the value of a given good frequently changes. An investigation of the causes of differences in the value of goods and an investigation of the measure of value are the subjects that will occupy us in this section. The course of our investigation is determined by the following consideration. The goods at our disposal have no value to us for their own sakes. On the contrary, we have seen that the only satisfaction of our needs has importance to us directly, since our lives and well-being are dependent on it. But I have also explained that men attribute this importance to the goods at their disposal if the goods ensure them the satisfaction of needs that would not be provided for it. But I have also explained that men attribute this importance to the goods at their disposal if the goods ensured the satisfaction of needs that would not be provided for if they did not have command of them. That is, they attribute this importance to economic goods. In the value of goods, therefore, we always encounter merely the significance we assign to the satisfaction of our needs, that is, to our lives and well-being. If I have adequately described the nature of the value of goods, if it has been established that in the final analysis only the satisfaction of our needs has importance to us, and if it has been established too that the value of all goods is merely an imputation of this importance to economic goods, then the differences we observe in the magnitude of value of different goods in actual life can only be found on differences in the magnitude of importance of the satisfactions that depend on our command of these goods. To reduce the differences that we observe in the magnitude of value of different goods in actual life to their ultimate causes, we must therefore perform a double task. We must investigate 1. To what extent different satisfactions have different degrees of importance to us, and 2. Which satisfactions of concrete needs depend in each individual case on our command of a particular good. If this investigation shows that separate satisfactions of concrete needs have different degrees of importance to us, and that these satisfactions of such different degrees of importance depend on our command of particular economic goods, we shall have solved our problem, for we shall have reduced the economic phenomenon whose explanation we stated to be the central problem of this investigation, to its ultimate causes. I mean differences in the magnitude of value of goods. With an answer to the question as to the ultimate causes of differences in the value of goods, a solution is also provided to the problem of how it comes about that the value of each of the various goods is itself subject to change. All change consists of nothing but differences through time. Hence, with the knowledge of the ultimate causes of the differences between the members of a set of magnitudes in general, we also obtain a deeper insight into their changes. Part A. Differences in the magnitude of importance of different satisfactions. As concerns the differences in the importance that different satisfactions have for us, it is above all a fact of the most common experience that the satisfactions of greatest importance to men are usually those which the maintenance of life depends, and that other satisfactions are graduated in a magnitude of importance according to the degree of pleasure dependent upon them. Thus, if economizing men must choose between the satisfaction of a need on which the maintenance of their lives depends, and an other on which merely a greater or less degree of well-being is dependent, they will usually prefer the former. Similarly, they will usually prefer satisfactions on which a higher degree of their well-being depends. With the same intensity, they will prefer pleasures of longer duration to pleasures of shorter duration, and with the same duration, pleasures of greater intensity to pleasures of less intensity. The maintenance of our lives depends on the satisfaction of our need for food, and also in our climate on clothing our bodies and having shelter at our disposal. But merely a higher degree of well-being depends on having a coach, a chessboard, etc. Thus we observe that men fear the lack of food, clothing, and shelter much more than the lack of a coach, a chessboard, etc. they also attribute a substantially higher importance to securing satisfaction of the former needs than they attribute to the satisfaction of needs on which, as in the case just mentioned, only a passing enjoyment or increased comfort, that is, merely a higher degree of their well-being depends. But these satisfactions also have very different degrees of importance. The maintenance of life depends neither on having a comfortable bed nor having a chessboard, but the use of these goods contributes, and certainly in very different degrees, to the increase of our well-being. Hence there can be no doubt that, when men have a choice between doing without a comfortable bed or doing without a chessboard, they will forego the latter much more readily than the former. We have thus seen that different satisfactions are very unequal in importance, since some are satisfactions that have the full importance to men of maintaining their lives, others are satisfactions that determine their well-being in a higher degree, still others in a less degree, and so on down to satisfactions on which some insignificant passing enjoyment depends. But careful examination of the phenomena of life shows that these differences in the importance of different satisfactions can be observed not only with the satisfaction of needs of different kinds, but also with the more or less complete satisfaction of one and the same need. The lives of men depend on satisfaction of their need for food in general, but it would be entirely erroneous to regard all the food they consume as being necessary for the maintenance of their lives or even their health, that is, for their continuing well-being. Everyone knows how easy it is to skip one of the usual meals without endangering life or health. Indeed, experience shows that the quantities of food necessary to maintain life are only a small part of what well-to-do persons as a rule consume, and that men even take much more food and drink than is necessary for the full preservation of health. Men consume food for several reasons. Above all, they take food to maintain life. Beyond this, they take further quantities to preserve health, since a diet sufficient merely to maintain life is too sparing. As experience shows, to avoid organic disorders. Finally, having already consumed quantities sufficient to maintain life and preserve health, men further partake of foods simply for the pleasure derived from their consumption. The separate concrete acts of satisfying the need for food, accordingly, have very different degrees of importance. The satisfaction of every man's need for food, up to the point where his life is thereby assured, has the full importance of the maintenance of his life. Consumption exceeding this amount, again, up to a certain point, has the importance of preserving his health, that is, his continuing well-being. Consumption extending beyond even this point has merely the importance, as observation shows, of a progressively weaker pleasure, until it finally reaches a certain limit at which satisfaction of the need for food is so complete that every further intake of food contributes neither to the maintenance of life nor to the preservation of health, nor does it even give pleasure to the consumer, becoming first a matter of indifference to him, eventually a cause of pain, a danger to health, and finally a danger to life itself. Similar observations can be made with respect to the more or less complete satisfaction of all other human needs. A room, or at least some place to sleep protected from the weather, is necessary in our climate for the maintenance of life, and reasonably spacious quarters for the preservation of health. In addition, however, men usually possess further accommodations, if they have the means merely for purposes of pleasure, drawing rooms, ballrooms, playrooms, pavilions, hunting lodges, etc. Thus, it is not difficult to recognize that the separate concrete acts of satisfying the need for shelter have very different degrees of importance. Up to a certain point, our lives depend on satisfying our needs for shelter. Beyond this, our health depends on a more complete satisfaction, and still further attempts to satisfy the same need will bring at first a greater and then a smaller enjoyment, until eventually a point can be conceived for each person at which the further employment of available accommodations would become a matter of complete indifference to him, and finally even burdensome. It is possible, therefore, with respect to the more or less complete satisfaction of one and the same need, to make an observation similar to the one made earlier with respect to the different needs of men. we saw earlier that the different needs of men are very unequal in importance to satisfaction, being graduated from the importance of their lives down to the importance they attribute to a small passing enjoyment. We see now, in addition, that the satisfaction of any one specific need has, up to a certain degree of completeness, relatively the highest importance, and that further satisfaction has a progressively smaller importance, until eventually a stage is reached at which the more complete satisfaction of that particular need is a matter of indifference. Ultimately, a stage occurs at which every act having the external appearance of a satisfaction of this need not only has no further importance to the consumer, but is rather a burden and a pain. In order to restate the preceding argument numerically, to facilitate comprehension of the subsequent difficult investigation, I shall designate the importance of satisfaction on which life depends with 10, and the smaller importance of the other satisfactions successively with 9, 8, 7, 6, etc. In this way, we obtain a scale of the importance of different satisfactions that begin with 10 and ends with 1. Let us now, for each of these different satisfactions, give numeral expressions to the additional importance, diminishing by degrees from the figure indicating the extent to which the particular need is already satisfied. Of further acts of satisfaction of that particular need. For satisfactions on which up to a certain point our lives depend, and on which beyond this point a well-being is dependent that steadily decreases with the degree of completeness of the satisfaction already achieved, we obtain a scale that begins with 10 and ends with 0. Similarly, for satisfactions whose highest importance is 9, we obtain a scale that begins with this figure and also ends with 0, and so on. The 10 scales obtained in this way are given in the following table. Suppose that the scale in column 1 expresses the importance to some one individual of satisfaction of his need for food, this importance diminishing according to the degree of satisfaction already attained, and that the scale in column 5 expresses similarly the importance of his need for tobacco. It is evident that satisfaction of his need for food up to a certain degree of completeness has a decidedly higher importance to this individual than satisfaction of his need for tobacco. But if his need for food is already satisfied up to a certain degree of completeness, if, for example, a further satisfaction of his need for food has only the importance to him that we designated numerically by the figure 6, consumption of tobacco begins to have the same importance to him as further satisfaction of his need for food. The individual will therefore endeavor, from this point on, to bring the satisfaction of his need for tobacco into equilibrium with satisfaction of his need for food. Although satisfaction of his need for food, in general, has substantially higher importance to the individual in question than satisfaction of his need for tobacco, with the progressive satisfaction of his former, a stage nevertheless, as illustrated in the table, at which further acts of satisfaction of his need for food have a smaller importance to him than the first acts of satisfying his need for tobacco, which, although less important in general, is at this stage still wholly unsatisfied. By this reference to an ordinary phenomenon of life, I believe I have clarified satisfactorily the meaning of the numbers in the table, which were chosen merely to facilitate demonstration of a difficult and previously unexplored field of psychology. The varying importance that satisfaction of separate concrete needs has for men is not foreign to the consciousness of any economizing man. However, little attention has hitherto been paid by scholars to the phenomena here treated. Wherever men live, and whatever level of civilization they occupy, we can observe how economizing individuals weigh the relative importance of satisfaction of their various needs in general, how they weigh, especially, the relative importance of the separate acts leading to the more or less complete satisfaction of each need, and how they are finally guided by the results of this comparison into activities directed to the fullest possible satisfaction of their needs. Indeed, this weighing of the relative importance of needs, this choosing between needs that are to remain unsatisfied and needs that are, in accordance with the available means, to attain satisfaction, and determining the degree to which the latter are to be satisfied, in the very part of the economic activity of men that fills their mind more than any other, that has the most far-reaching influence on their economic efforts, and that is exercised almost continually by every economizing individual. But human knowledge of the different degrees of importance of satisfaction, of different needs, and of different acts of satisfaction is also the first cause of differences in the value of goods. Part B. The dependence of separate satisfactions on particular goods. If opposite each particular concrete need of men, there was but a single available good, and that good was suitable exclusively for the satisfaction of the one need, so that on the one side, satisfaction of the need would not take place if the particular good were not at our disposal, and on the other side, the good would be capable of serving for the satisfaction of that concrete need and no other. The determination of the value of the good would be very easy. It would be equal to the importance we attribute to the satisfaction of that need. For it is evident that whenever we are dependent in satisfying a given need on the availability of a certain good, that is, whenever the satisfaction would not take place if we did not have the good at our disposal, and when that good is, at the same time, not suitable for any other useful purpose, it can attain the full but never any other importance than that which the given satisfaction has for us. Hence, according to whether the importance of the given satisfaction to us, in a case such as this, is greater or smaller, the value of the particular good to us will be greater or smaller. If, for instance, a myopic individual were cast away on a lonely island and found among the goods he had salvaged just one pair of glasses correcting his myopia, but no second pair, there is no doubt that these glasses would have the full importance to him that he attributes to the corrected eyesight, and just as certainly no greater importance, since the glasses would hardly be suitable for the satisfaction of other needs. But in ordinary life, the relationship between available goods and our needs is generally much more complicated. Usually not a single good, but a quantity of goods stands opposite, not a single concrete need, but a complex of such needs. Sometimes a larger and sometimes a smaller number of satisfactions of very different degrees of importance depends on our command of a given quantity of goods, and each one of the goods has the ability to produce these satisfactions differing so greatly in importance. An isolated farmer, after a rich harvest, has more than 200 bushels of wheat at his disposal. A portion of this secures him the maintenance of his own and his family's lives until the next harvest, and another portion the preservation of health, and a third portion assures him seed grain for the next seeding. A fourth portion may be employed for the production of beer, whiskey, and other luxuries, and a fifth portion may be used for the fattening of his cattle. Several remaining bushels, which he cannot use further for these more important satisfactions, he allots to the feeding of pets in order to make the balance of his grain in some way useful. The farmer is therefore dependent upon the grain in his possession for satisfactions of very different degrees of importance. At first, he secures with it his own and his family's lives, and then his own and his family's health. Beyond this, he secures with it the uninterrupted operation of his farm, an important foundation of his continuing welfare. Finally, he employs a portion of his grain for purposes of pleasure, and in so doing is again employing his grain for purposes that are of very different degrees of importance to him. We are thus considering a case, one that is typical of ordinary life, in which satisfactions of very different degrees of importance depend on the availability of a quantity of good, that we shall assume, for the sake of greater simplicity, to be composed of the completely homogeneous units. The question that now arises is, what, under the given conditions, is the value of a certain portion of the grain to our farmer? Will the bushels of grain that secure his own and his family's lives have a higher value to him than the bushels that enable him to seed his fields? And will the latter bushels have a greater value to him than the bushels of grain he employs for purposes of pleasure? No one will deny that the satisfactions that seem assured by the various portions of that available supply of grain are very unequal in importance, ranging from an importance of 10 to an importance of 1 in terms of our earlier designations. Yet no one will be able to maintain that some bushels of grain, those, for instance, with which the farmer will nourish himself and his family till the next harvest, will have a higher value to him than other bushels of the same quality, those, for instance, from which he will make luxury beverages. In this and in every other case where satisfactions of different degrees of importance depend on command for a given quantity of goods, we are, above all, faced with a difficult question: which particular satisfaction is dependent on a particular portion of the quantity of goods in question. The solution of this most important question of the theory of value follows from reflection upon human economy and the nature of value. We have seen that the efforts of men are directed toward fully satisfying their needs, and where this is impossible, towards satisfying them as completely as possible. If a quantity of goods stands opposite needs of varying importance to men, they will first satisfy or provide for those needs whose satisfaction has the greatest importance to them. If there are any goods remaining, they will direct themselves to the satisfaction of needs that are next in degree of importance to those already satisfied. Any further remainder will be applied consecutively to the satisfaction of needs that come next in degree of importance. If a good can be used for the satisfaction of several different kinds of needs, and if with respect to each kind of need, successive single acts of satisfaction each have diminishing importance according to the degree of completeness with which the need in question has already been satisfied, economizing men will first employ the quantities of the good that are available to them to secure those acts of satisfaction, without regard to the kind of need which they will have highest importance for them. They will employ any remaining quantities to secure satisfactions of concrete needs that are next in importance, and any further remainder to secure successively less important satisfactions. The end result of this procedure is that the most important of the satisfactions that cannot be achieved have the same importance for every kind of need, and hence that all needs are being satisfied up to an equal degree of importance with the separate acts of satisfaction. We've been asking what value a given unit of a quantity of goods possessed by an economizing individual has for him. Our question could be more precisely stated with respect to the nature of value if it is stated in this form: which satisfaction would not be attained if the economizing individual did not have a given unit at his disposal. That is, if he were to have command of a total amount smaller by that one unit. The answer which follows from the previous exposition of the nature of human economy is that every economizing individual would, in this case, with a quantity of goods yet remaining to him, by all means satisfy his more important needs and forego satisfaction of the less important ones. Thus, of all the satisfaction previously obtained, only the one that has the smallest importance to him would now be unattained. Accordingly, in every concrete case of all the satisfactions secured by means of the whole quantity of a good at the disposal of an economizing individual, only those that have the least importance to him are dependent on the availability of a given portion of the whole quantity. Hence the value to this person of any portion of the whole available quantity of the good is equal to the importance to him of the satisfactions of least importance among those assured by the whole quantity and achieved with an equal portion. Suppose that an individual needs 10 discrete units, or 10 measures, of a good for the full satisfaction of all his needs for that good. That these needs vary in importance from 10 to 1, but that he only has 7 units, or only 7 measures of the good at his command. From what has been said about the nature of human economy, it is directly evident that this individual will satisfy only those of his needs for the good that range in importance from 10 to 4, with the quantity at his command 7 units, and that the other needs, ranging in importance from 3 to 1, will remain unsatisfied. What is the value to the economizing individual in question of one of his 7 units or measures in this case? According to what we have learned about the nature of the value of goods, this question is equivalent to the question, what is the importance of the satisfaction that would have been unattained if the individual concerned would have only 6 instead of 7 units or measures at his command. If some accident were to deprive him of one of his 7 goods or measures, it is clear that the person in question would use the remaining 6 units to satisfy the more important needs and would neglect the least important one. Hence the result of losing one good or one measure would be that only the least of all the satisfactions assured by the whole available quantity of 7 units, i.e., the satisfaction whose importance was designated as 4, would be lost, while those satisfactions or acts of satisfying needs whose importance ranges from 10 to 5 would take place as before. In this case, therefore, only a satisfaction whose importance was designated by 4 will depend on command of a single unit or measure, as long as the individual in question continues to have command of 7 units or measures of the good. The value of each unit or measure will be equal to the importance of this satisfaction, for it is only this satisfaction with an importance of 4 that depends on 1 unit or measure of the available quantity of the good. Other things being equal, if only 5 units or measures of the good were available to the economizing individual in question, it is evident that as long as this economic situation persisted, each discrete unit or partial quantity of the good would have an importance to him expressed numerically by the figure 6. If he had 3 units, each one would have an importance to him expressed numerically by the figure 8. Finally, if he had but a single good, its importance would be equal to 10. Examination of a number of particular cases will fully elucidate the principles here set forth, and I do not wish to shirk this important task. Even though I know that I shall appear tiresome to some readers, following in the path of Adam Smith, I will risk some tediousness to gain clarity of exposition. To begin with the simplest case, suppose that an isolated economizing individual inhabits a rocky island in the sea, that he finds only a single spring on the island, and that he is exclusively dependent upon it for satisfaction of his need for fresh water. Assume that this isolated individual needs a. 1 unit of water daily for the maintenance of his life, b. 19 units for the animals whose milk and meat provide him with the most necessary means of substance, c. 40 units, partly so that he may consume the full quantity necessary to the maintenance not only of his life, but also his health, partly to the extent necessary for the continuance of his health and general well-being, to clean his body, his clothes, and his implements, and partly for the support of some additional animals whose milk and meat he finds needful, and finally, d. 40 additional units of water daily, partly for his flower garden, and partly for some animals which he keeps not for the maintenance of his life and health, but simply for the purpose of a more varied diet, or for mere companionship. Assume, too, that he does not know how to employ more than this total of 100 units of water. As long as the spring provides water so copiously that he can not only satisfy all his needs for water, but let several thousand pails flow into the sea every day, and thus as long as the satisfaction of none of these needs depends upon whether he has 1 unit more or 1 unit less at his disposal, a unit of water will, as we have seen, have neither economic character nor value to him, and thus there can be no question of the magnitude of its value. But if some natural event should now suddenly cause the spring to become partially exhausted, and if our island dweller should, as a result, have only 90 units of water at his disposal, while he continues to require 100 units for the full satisfaction of his needs, it is clear that some satisfaction would then be dependent on the availability of each portion of the whole supply of water, and hence that each particular unit of water would attain that significance for him that we call value. If we now, however, ask which of his satisfactions is, in this case, dependent on a given portion of the 90 units of water available to him, on 10 units for instance, our question takes the following form. Which satisfactions of our isolated individual would not be attained if he did not have this given portion of the supply at his disposal? That is, if he should have 80 instead of 90 units. Nothing is more certain than our economizing individual would continue, even if he had only 80 units of water available daily, to consume the quantity necessary for the preservation of his life, and as much more as will maintain as many animals as are indispensable for keeping him alive. Since these purposes require only 20 units of water daily, he would apply the remaining 60 units first to the satisfaction of all the needs on which his health and his continuing general well-being depend. Since for this purpose he requires a total of only 40 pails of water daily, he would have 20 units left, which could be employed for purposes of mere enjoyment. The last 20 units could thus maintain either his flower garden or the animals he owns purely for pleasure. He would certainly choose from the two satisfactions, the one appearing to him to be more important, and would neglect the less important one. When our Crusoe has 90 units of water available to him daily, the question whether he will continue to have this quantity or 10 units less at his disposal is, for him, equivalent to the question whether or not he will be in a position to continue to satisfy the least important needs that are being satisfied with 10 units of water daily. As long, therefore, as a total quantity of go units continues at his disposal, 10 units of water will have only the importance of these least important satisfactions. That is, only the importance of relatively insignificant enjoyments. Suppose now that the spring supplying the individual of the isolated economy with water is even further exhausted, to such an extent indeed that only 40 units of water are available to him daily. Now again, just as before, the maintenance of his life and well-being will depend on the availability of this whole quantity of water. But the situation has changed in an important respect. If earlier some one of his pleasures or comforts depended on the availability of each, in any way practically significant, part of the whole supply, 1 unit for instance, now the question of a unit more or a unit less of water being available per day is, for our Crusoe, already a question of the more or less complete maintenance of his health or general well-being. In other words, if he should lose 1 unit, the effect would be that he could no longer satisfy one of the needs on whose satisfaction the preservation of his health and his continuing general well-being depend. If a single pail of water had no value whatsoever to our Crusoe, as long as he had several hundred pails at his disposal daily, and if later, when he only had 90 units daily, each unit had only the importance of some particular enjoyment dependent upon it, now each part of the 40 units still available has the importance to him of much more important satisfactions, for now the satisfactions of needs whose non-satisfaction impairs his health and continuing well-being depends on each one of the 40 units. But the value of each quantity of goods is equal to the importance of the satisfaction that depends on it. If the value of 1 unit of water to our Crusoe was at first equal to 0, and in the second case equal to 1, it would now already be expressed numerically by something like this figure 6. Suppose with continued drought the spring should become more and more exhausted, and finally yield just the amount of water daily that is required barely to support the life of this isolated individual. Hence, in our case, approximately 20 units, since he requires that much for himself and for those animals of his herd without whose milk and meat he cannot keep alive. In such a case, it is clear that each practically significant quantity of water available to him would have the full importance of the maintenance of his life. Hence, a unit of water would have a still higher value than before, a value expressed numerically by the figure 10. Thus, in the first of our cases, we saw, as long as the individual has several thousand pails of water at his disposal daily, a small portion of this quantity, 1 pail for instance, has no value to him at all, because no kind of satisfaction depended on any single pail. In the second case, we saw that a concrete unit of the 90 units available to him already had the importance of certain minor enjoyments, since the least important satisfactions that depended on 90 units were these enjoyments. In the third case, when only 40 units of water a day were at his disposal, we saw more important satisfactions were dependent on each concrete unit. In the fourth case, still more important satisfactions became dependent on each concrete unit. In each succeeding case, we saw the value of the remaining units rise successively as more important satisfactions became dependent on them. To pass on to more complicated social relationships, suppose that a sailing ship still has 20 days of sailing to reach land, and that by some accident its stores of food are almost completely lost, and that only such a quantity of some one variety of food, biscuits, for instance, is left for each of the shipmates as is sufficient for the preservation of his life for the 20 days. This is a case in which given needs of the persons on the sailing ship stand opposite command of just the precise quantity of a given good that makes the satisfaction of these needs wholly dependent on the available quantity of the good. If it is assumed that the lives of the voyagers can be maintained only if each of them consumes a half-pound of biscuits daily, and that each voyager has actual possession of 10 pounds of biscuits, then this quantity of food will have for each voyager the full importance of maintaining his life. Under such conditions, no one who prizes his own life at all could be prevailed upon to surrender this quantity of goods, or even any appreciable part of it, for any goods other than foodstuffs, even for the most valuable goods of ordinary life. If, for example, a rich man traveling on a boat should offer a pound of gold for the same weight of biscuits to alleviate the pangs of hunger inevitable with such scant rations, he would find none of his shipmates ready to accept such a bargain. Suppose next that the voyagers on the ship have command of another 5 pounds of ship's biscuits each, in addition to the 10 pounds already mentioned. In this case, their lives would no longer depend on their command of a single pound of biscuits, since 1 pound could be withdrawn from their control or exchanged by them for goods other than foodstuffs, without endangering their lives. Even though their very lives would no longer depend on 1 pound of the food, a pound of it would nevertheless constitute a protection against the pangs of hunger, as well as the means of preservation of their health, since such scanty nourishment continued for 20 days, as would be the fare of all persons having only 10 pounds of biscuits at their disposal, would unquestionably have an injurious effect on their well-being. Under such circumstances, although a single pound of biscuits would no longer have the importance to them of maintaining their lives, it would nevertheless have the importance everyone attaches to the preservation of his health and well-being, insofar as these depend on a single pound of biscuits. Let us assume, finally, that the galley of the ship has been completely denuded of all its food stores, that the voyagers are also without any food of their own, that the ship is laden with a cargo of several thousand hundredweight of biscuits, and that the captain of the ship, in consideration of the unfortunate situation of the voyagers as a result of this calamity, authorizes everyone to nourish himself at will with biscuits. The voyagers will, of course, take the biscuits to still their hunger, but no one will doubt that a palatable piece of meat would, in such a case, have considerable value to a voyager, whose entire fare for 20 days would otherwise consist of biscuits alone, while a pound of biscuits would have an extraordinarily small value, and perhaps no value at all. Why did command of a pound of biscuits have the full importance of maintaining his life to each voyager in this first of these cases, still a very great importance in the second case, but no importance whatsoever, or at any rate, or only an exceedingly slight importance in the third case? The needs of the voyagers remained the same in all three cases, since neither their personalities nor their requirements changed. What did change, however, was the quantity of food standing opposite these requirements each case. Opposite identical requirements for food on the part of the voyagers. There were 10 pounds of food per person in the first case, a larger quantity in the second case, and still a larger quantity in the third case. Hence, from one case to the next, the importance of the satisfactions that were dependent on single units of the food declined progressively. But what we have been able to observe here, at first with an isolated individual, and then in a group temporarily isolated from the rest of humanity, is equally valid for the more complex interrelationships of a people and of human society in general. The situation of the inhabitants of a country after a crop failure, after an average crop, and finally in a year following a bumper crop, presents relationships analogous in nature to those described above. Here also, opposite certain definite requirements, there is a smaller available quantity of food in the first case than in the second case, and a smaller one in the second case than in the third. Hence, in these cases also, the importance of the satisfactions that depend on single units of the whole supply varies considerably. If an elevator with 100,000 bushels of wheat burns down in a country that has just had a bumper crop, the effect of the calamity will at most be that less alcohol will be produced, or that the poorer part of the population will at worst be fed somewhat more scantily without suffering deprivation. If the calamity occurs after an average crop, many people will already have to forego more important satisfactions, and if the misfortune coincides with a famine, a great many people will die of hunger. In each of the three cases, satisfactions of very different degrees of importance depend on each concrete unit of the grain available to the people concerned, and for this reason, the value of a unit of grain varies greatly in the three cases. If we summarize what has been said, we obtain the following principles as the result of our investigation thus far. 1. The importance that goods have for us and which we call value is merely imputed. Basically, only satisfactions have importance for us, because the maintenance of our lives and well-being depend on them, but we logically impute this importance to the goods on whose availability we are conscious of being dependent for these satisfactions. 2. The magnitudes of importance that different satisfactions of concrete needs, the separate acts of satisfaction that can be realized by means of individual goods, have for us are unequal, and their measure lies in the degree of their importance for the maintenance of our lives and welfare. 3. The magnitudes of the importance of our satisfactions that are imputed to goods, that is, the magnitudes of their values, are therefore also unequal, and their measure lies in the degree of importance that the satisfactions dependent on the goods in question have for us. 4. In each particular case, of all the satisfactions assured by the whole available quantity of a good, only those that have the least importance to an economizing individual are dependent on command of a given portion of the whole quantity. 5. The value of a particular good or of a given portion of the whole quantity of a good at the disposal of an economizing individual is thus for him equal to the importance for the least important of the satisfactions assured by the whole available quantity and achieved with any equal portion. For it is with respect to these least important satisfactions that the economizing individual concerned is dependent on the availability of the particular good, or given quantity of a good. Thus, our investigation to this point, we have traced the differences in the value of goods back to their ultimate causes, and have also, at the same time, found the ultimate and original measure by which the values of all goods are judged by men. If what has been said is correctly understood, there can be no difficulty in solving any problem involving the explanation of the causes determining the differences between the values of two or more concrete goods or quantities of goods. If we ask, for example, why a pound of drinking water has no value whatsoever to us under ordinary circumstances, while a minimum fraction of a pound of gold or diamonds generally exhibits a very high value, the answer is as follows. Diamonds and gold are so rare that all diamonds available to mankind could be kept in a chest and all the gold in a single large room, as a simple calculation will show. Drinking water, on the other hand, is found in such large quantities on the earth that a reservoir can hardly be imagined large enough to hold it all. Accordingly, men are able to satisfy only the most important needs that gold and diamonds serve to satisfy, while they are usually in a position not only to satisfy their needs for drinking water fully, but in addition also to let the large quantities of it escape unused, since they are unable to use up the whole available quantity. Under ordinary circumstances, therefore, no human need, would have to remain unsatisfied if men were unable to command some particular quantity of drinking water. With gold and diamonds, on the other hand, even the least significant satisfactions assured by the total quantity available still have a relatively high importance to economizing men. Thus, concrete quantities of drinking water usually have no value to economizing men, but concrete quantities of gold and diamonds a high value. All this holds only for the ordinary circumstances of life, when drinking water is available to us in copious quantities and gold and diamonds in very small quantities. In the desert, however, where the life of a traveler is often dependent on a drink of water, it can by all means be imagined that more important satisfactions depend for an individual on a pound of water than even on a pound of gold. In such a case, the value of a pound of water would consequently be greater for the individual concerned than the value of a pound of gold. And experience teaches us that such a relationship, or one that is similar, actually develops where the economic situation is, as I have just described. Part C. The influence of differences in the quality of goods on their value. Human needs can often be satisfied by goods of different types, and still more frequently by goods that differ, not as to type, but as to kind, where we deal with given complexes of human needs on the one side, and with the quantities of goods available for their satisfaction on the other side. The needs do not, therefore, always stand opposite quantities of homogeneous goods, but often opposite goods of different types, and still more frequently opposite goods of different kinds. For greater simplicity of exposition, I have until now omitted consideration of the differences between goods, and have, in the preceding sections, considered only cases in which quantities of completely homogeneous goods stand opposite needs of a specific type, stressing particularly the way in which their importance decreases in accordance with the degree of completeness of the satisfaction already attained. In this way, I was able to give greater emphasis to the influence that differences in the available quantities exercise on the value of goods. The cases that now remain to be taken into consideration are those in which given human needs may be satisfied by goods of different types or kinds, and in which, therefore, give human requirements stand opposite available quantities of goods of which separate portions are qualitatively different. In this connection, it should first be noted that differences between goods, whether they be differences of type or of kind, cannot affect the value of the different units of a given supply, even if the satisfaction of human needs is in no way affected by these differences. Goods that satisfy human needs in an identical fashion are for this very reason regarded as completely homogeneous from an economic point of view, even though they may belong to different types or kinds on the basis of external appearance. If the differences, as to type or kind, between two goods are to be responsible for differences in their value, it is necessary that they also have different capacities to satisfy human needs. In other words, it is necessary that they have what we call, from an economic point of view, differences in quality. An examination of the influence that differences in quality exercise on the value of particular goods is therefore the subject of the following investigation. From an economic standpoint, the qualitative differences between goods may be of two kinds. Human needs may be satisfied either in a quantitatively or in a qualitatively different manner, by means of equal quantities and of qualitatively different goods. With a given quantity of beechwood, for instance, the human need for warmth may be satisfied in a quantitatively more intensive manner than with the same quantity of fir. But two equal quantities of foodstuffs of equal food value may satisfy the need for food in qualitatively different fashions, since the consumption of one dish may, for example, provide enjoyment, while the other may provide either no enjoyment or only an inferior one. With goods of the first category, the inferior quality can be fully compensated for this by a larger quantity, but with goods of the second category, this is not possible. Fir, alder, or pine can replace beechwood for heating purposes, and if coal or inferior carbon content, oak bark of inferior tannin content, and the ordinary labor services of tardy or less efficient day laborers are only available to economizing men in sufficiently large quantities, they can generally replace the more highly qualified goods perfectly. But even if unpalatable foods or beverages, dark and wet rooms, the services of mediocre physicians, etc., are available in the largest quantities, they can never satisfy our needs as well, qualitatively, as the corresponding more highly qualified goods. When economizing individuals appraise the value of a good, it is purely a question, as we have seen, of estimating the importance of satisfaction of those needs with respect to which they are dependent on command of the good. The quantity of a good that will bring about the satisfaction is, however, only a secondary factor in value. For if smaller quantities of a highly qualified good will satisfy a human need in the same, that is, in a quantitatively and qualitatively identical manner, as larger quantities of the less qualified good, it is evident that the smaller quantities of the more highly qualified good will have the same value to economizing men as the larger quantities of the less qualified good. Thus, equal quantities of goods having different qualities of the first kind will display values that are unequal in the proportion indicated. If, for example, in determining the value of oak bark, we take account exclusively of its tannin content, and 700 weight of one grade has the same effectiveness as 800 weight of another grade, it will also have the same value as the latter quantity to the artisans using the bark, merely reducing these goods to quantities of equal economic effectiveness, a procedure actually employed in the economic activities of men in all such cases, thus completely removes the difficulty in determining the value of given quantities of different qualities, so far as their effectiveness is merely quantitatively different. In this way, the more complicated case under consideration is reduced to the simple relationship explained earlier. The question of the influence of different qualities on the values of particular goods is more complicated, when the qualitative differences between the goods cause needs to be satisfied in qualitatively different ways. There could be no doubt, after what has been said about the general principle of value determination, that it is the importance of the needs that would remain unsatisfied if we did not have command of a particular good, of not only the general type, but also the specific quality corresponding to these needs, that is, in this case too, the factor determining its value. The difficulty I am discussing here does not, therefore, lie in the general principle of value determination being inapplicable to these goods, but rather in the determination of the particular satisfaction that depends on a particular concrete good when a whole group of needs stands opposite goods whose various units are capable of satisfying these needs in qualitatively different ways. In other words, it lies in the practical application of the general principle of value determination to human economic activity. The solution to this problem arises from the following considerations. Economizing individuals do not use the quantities of goods available to them without regarding to the differences in quality when these exist. A farmer who has grain of different grades at his disposal does not, for example, use the worst grade for seeding, grain of medium quality as cattle feed, and the best for food and the production of beverages. Nor does he use the grains of different grades indiscriminately for one purpose or another. Rather, with a view to his requirements, he employs the best grade for seeding, the best that remains for food and beverages, and the grain of poorest quality for fattening cattle. With goods whose units are homogeneous to the total available quantity of a good stands opposite the whole set of concrete needs that can be satisfied by means of it. But in cases where the different units of a good satisfy human needs in qualitatively different ways, the total available quantity of a good no longer stands opposite the whole set of needs. Each available quantity of specific quality instead stands opposite corresponding specific needs of the economizing individuals. If, with respect to a given consumption purpose, a good of a certain quality cannot be replaced at all by goods of any other quality, the principle of value determination previously demonstrated applies fully and directly to particular quantities of that good. Thus, the value of any particular unit of such a good is equal to the importance of the least important satisfaction that is provided for by the total available quantity of this precise quality of good, since it is with respect to this satisfaction that we are actually dependent on command of the particular unit of this quality. But human needs can be satisfied by means of goods of different qualifications, although in qualitatively different ways. If goods of one quality can be replaced by goods of another quality, though not with the same effectiveness, the value of a unit of the goods of superior quality is equal to the importance of the least important satisfaction that is provided for by the goods of superior quality minus the value quota that is greater. 1. The smaller the value of the goods of inferior quality by which the particular need in question can also be satisfied, and 2. The smaller the difference to men between the importance of satisfying the particular need with the superior good and importance of satisfying it with the inferior one. Thus we arrive at the result that, even in cases in which the complex of needs stands opposite a quantity of goods of different qualities, satisfactions of intensities always depend on each partial quantity or on each concrete unit of these goods. Hence, in all the cases discussed, the principle of value determination that I formulated above maintains its full applicability. Part D. The subjective character of the measure of value, labor and value error. When I discuss the nature of value, I observe that value is nothing inherent in goods and that it is not a property of goods. But neither is value an independent thing. There is no reason why a good may not have value to one economizing individual, but no value to another individual under different circumstances. The measure of value is entirely subjective in nature, and for this reason, a good can have great value to one economizing individual, little value to another, and no value to a third, depending upon the differences in their requirements and available amounts. What one person disdains or values lightly is appreciated by another, and what one person abandons is often picked up by another, while one economizing individual esteems equally a given amount of one good and a greater amount of another good. We frequently observe just the opposite evaluations with another economizing individual. Hence, not only the nature, but also the measure of value is subjective. Goods always have value to certain economizing individuals, and this value is always determined only by these individuals. The value an economizing individual attributes to a good is equal to the importance of the particular satisfaction that depends on his command of the good. There is no necessary and direct connection between the value of a good and whether or in what quantities labor and other goods of a higher order were applied to its production. A non-economic good, a quantity of timber in a virgin forest, for example, does not attain value for men if large quantities of labor or other economic goods were applied to its production. Whether a diamond was found accidentally or was obtained from a diamond pit with the employment of 1,000 days of labor is completely irrelevant for its value. In general, no one in practical life asks for the history of the origin of a good in estimating its value, but considers solely the services that the good will render him and which he would have to forego if he did not have it at his command. Goods on which much labor has been expended often have no value, while others, on which little or no labor was expended, have a very high value. Goods on which much labor was expended and others which no labor was expended are often equal value to economizing men. The quantities of labor or of other means of production applied to its production cannot, therefore, be the determining factor in the value of a good. Comparison of the value of a good with the value of the means of production employed in its production does, of course, show whether and to what extent its production, an act of past human activity, was appropriate or economic. But the quantities of goods employed in the production of a good have neither a necessary nor directly determining influence on its value. Equally untenable is the opinion that the determining factor in the value of goods is the quantity of labor or other means of production that are necessary for their reproduction. A large number of goods cannot be reproduced. Antiques and paintings by old masters, for instance, and thus, in a number of cases, we can observe the value, but no possibility of reproduction. For this reason, any factor connected with reproduction cannot be the determining principle of value in general. Experience, moreover, shows that the value of the means of production necessary for the reproduction of many goods, old-fashioned clothes and obsolete machines, for instance, is sometimes considerably higher and sometimes lower than the value of the products themselves. The determining factor in the value of a good, then, is neither the quantity of labor or other goods necessary for its production, nor the quantity of labor for its reproduction, but rather the magnitude of importance of those satisfactions with respect to which we are conscious of being dependent on command of the good. This principle of value determination is universally valid, and no exception to it can be found in human society. The importance of a satisfaction to us is not the result of an arbitrary decision, but rather is a measure by the importance, which is not arbitrary, that the satisfaction has for our lives or for our well-being. The relative degrees of importance of different satisfactions and of successive acts of satisfaction are nevertheless matters of judgment on the part of economizing men, and for this reason their knowledge for these degrees of importance is, in some instances, subject to error. We saw earlier that the satisfactions on which their lives depend have the highest importance to men, that the satisfactions following next in importance are those on which their well-being depends, and that satisfactions on which a higher degree of well-being depends, with equal intensity a longer enduring satisfaction, and with the same duration a more intensive one, have a higher importance to men than those on which a lower degree of their well-being is dependent. But what has been said by no means excludes the possibility that stupid men may, as a result of their defective knowledge, sometimes estimate the importance of various satisfactions in a manner contrary to their real importance. Even individuals whose economic activity is conducted rationally, and those, therefore, certainly endeavor to recognize their true importance of satisfactions in order to gain an accurate foundation for their economic activity, are subject to error. Error is inseparable from all human knowledge. Men are especially prone to let themselves be misled into overestimating the importance of satisfactions that give intense momentary pleasure but contribute only fleetingly to their well-being, and so into underestimating the importance of satisfactions on which a less intensive but longer enduring well-being depends. In other words, men often esteem passing intense enjoyments more highly than their permanent welfare, and sometimes even more than their lives. If men are thus already often in error with respect to their knowledge of the subjective factor of value determination, when it is merely a question of appraising their own states of mind, they are even more likely to err when it is a question of their perception of the objective factor of the value determination, especially when it is a question of their knowledge of the magnitudes of the quantities available to them, and of the different qualities of goods. For these reasons alone, it is clear why the determination of the value of particular goods is beset with manifold errors in economic life. But in addition to value fluctuations that arise from changes in human needs, from changes in the quantities of goods available to men, and from changes in physical properties of goods, we can also observe fluctuations in the values of goods that are caused simply by changes in the knowledge men have of the importance of goods for their lives and welfare.